set of bus stops, you've got a timetable, you have to engage with the buses at those bus stops according to that timetable, and you can get from A to B to C to D. Alternatively, if you think about Uber, and I'm not thinking of Uber as a great example of digital civics, obviously, with their sort of shocking employment practices, but let's say a car mobility scheme, something like Uber, if you think of that, that's actually a relational model of mobility. Because what it's framing is the mobility as someone with mobility needs, the customer in this case, or the citizen, someone with mobility capacity, the person with a car, and the digital service is brokering people with those needs and people with that capacity to coordinate those resources being deployed at a certain time. And of course the trust building, well, you know, okay, the Uber review system, maybe we don't call it, is actually, you know, I think I read a cartoon the other day. You give it 5, that means the ride happens. You give it 4 or less, you're threatening someone's livelihood. But you can imagine a review system as a mechanism for building trust between people. So that's a relational model. So it feels a bit fluffy. Let's sort of drill down a bit. So let's take a really simple example of a relational model. So this should be something within everyone's experience, not particularly challenged. So public health. What's a relational model of public health that fits in this digital civics? This was one of the first pieces of work done by Madeline Baylor in our group and Andy Garber, a PhD student. And it was around the challenge of breastfeeding. So if you don't know, actually public health people talk about a crisis in breastfeeding in the Western world. Breastfeeding rates are going down. There's lots of great benefits to breastfeeding in terms of sort of mother and child outcome. And of course, the traditional methods of encouraging women to breastfeed are very transactional. You know, they're transactional, like, you know, midwife GP gives you a leaflet that says you're going to be a bad mother and your child's going to get 2 grades lower when they're age 16. And you know, this is the sort of mode of promoting breastfeeding. But actually, when you workshop these mothers, so we did some design activities with mothers in Newcastle, they talked about, you know, so one of the big reasons they might not breastfeed is they feel they're going to be stuck at home for months. Because actually when they go out, there aren't good facilities for breastfeeding. There's sort of funny attitudes in the public, but primarily around the resources and the facilities when they're out. So they feel it's going to be a barrier to them leading the sort of day-to-day life we want. So we did something really simple, which is within everyone's understanding. We built a TripAdvisor for breastfeeding. Yeah? So it's literally just an app where women can rate locations on 4 criteria, which we designed with them. It's sort of friendliness of staff, cleanliness, the cost of the place where you're doing it. And they rate it, and it pushes up into a map, and it gets pushed on social media as well. So ever so simple. And even this is just like a little bit of someone's PhD, and it has 9,000, 10,000 users, several thousand reviews. We've got a Chi paper on it, we've got a BMJ open paper doing a content analysis of what women write in the reviews and how that could be implemented. We've got a PhD student who's visiting actually this week, looking at using the data from this, the sort of things women write about breastfeeding public, to shape breastfeeding policy at a local level. So, but it's very simple. You know, our partners in it, local government, still, you know, are sort of uncertain about it. They're uncertain about it because they're saying, well, what if someone puts a bad review? Well, you know, these are the spaces that people occupy every day online and understand what a bad review is, or a review they're not going to trust. But the difference here is we're actually framing, this is a system where you frame women not as the problem, but women as actually the solution, women as the people, as the experts with the experience, and we're essentially infrastructuring these mothers to share their knowledge and experience. That's typically not something that you think of as a sort of government model of a service. The typical model is transactional. Maybe even if they think locations quality does matter, they'll think they need to produce a list of approved locations. So that's sort of simple and it's sort of nice, but actually it's still too top down. You know, if we really think about sort of democratic approaches to technology, in the sense that we're designing the app and giving it to mothers and say use it. Yeah, and in this case there was a demand for it immediately, but why can't anyone commission a piece of technology like this for whatever they want it to be? So our next thing was to build a system called App Movement. So this is a generalization of this sort of relational model where literally anyone can come on the website and say, I want one of these location reviews for X. And X can be, actually I'll get the system actually much better to show you it actually live. I hope I can feel the, oh no, I haven't. So it could be, where to find free condoms. Actually, there's a local charity in Newcastle who provides free condoms to different vendors, and this is where you can find the free condoms. This is actually a breastfeeding group in Lebanon, where it's women want their own breastfeeding app with different criteria, because things like not smoking is a sort of key thing in Lebanon if you want a breastfeeding place, and obviously you can't smoke in public places there. There's a nice one here, where to fly your drone. So that's why people want to know where they can fly their drone. So, you know, you can look at this and think, well, it's a bit like Kickstarter, or it's a sort of Kickstarter meets change.org. And so if you look at that, Safe Places to Fly Your Drone, actually, all that happens is, this guy, Simon Newton, he's got a little YouTube channel about drones. He comes on here and he says, he writes a bit of text saying, oh, we need to show that we're responsible drone flyers by mapping places that are good to fly drones and doing there before the regulators tell us we can't do anything. So, you know, he's got a social purpose there, and he's interested in drones. I don't know anything about drones, of course, but he does this, and he gets a bunch of people support it. So he's got a network, a couple of hundred people support it. We have a threshold here of 50 initially. You need 50 supporters. So the supporters go on there, just click support, register, maybe write a few encouraging comments. And then what happens is it goes in, if you hit the threshold for support, it goes into a design phase. So in the design phase, any one of those supporters can come on and suggest a name for the app, or an icon, or a colour scheme, or suggest a rating option. So if we look at, I think I've got the rating options up here. So the rating options, so, you know, not massive levels of participation in the design. People can propose things. A note field for issues, parking, any location, and they can vote for each other. So these top four are the green highlighted ones. Scenic value, suitably for training, ease of access, how quiet it is, yeah? And what happens is at the end of the week, in all those criteria, name, icon, the review criteria, the app is then automatically generated. Because of course, it's just the Feed Finder app with certain fields changed according to what those communities have done. So essentially what happens is we then generate the Android app, generate the iOS app, no one's building it, it's getting produced automatically, obviously we're submitting it to the app stores, and then the people who have engaged in that process of support and design, they're actually going to be the ones who are going to start putting the reviews in to start with. Because if you think about it, a review system like this, it's the network effect. A review system with no reviews in is no use to anyone. So what you need to do is you need to source your audience at the conception phase. So that's exactly what happened here. So if you look at, these are apps that have come through here. There's one, local photography spots. If you look at that, that's sort of, I don't know, small scale. So it's actually created by a group a Facebook group in Newcastle who take photographs. And if you look at, you can't really see the map very well here, this is the United Kingdom. There's something like 600 venues in there, a couple of thousand people registered to use the app, so you can see the photos that people have done. Basically identifying locations where have nice photos. If you took something like the drone zones, that's a bit different. So this is 50,000 registered users, 18,000 locations. And remember, this is just like a little bit of someone's PhD, and yet you can produce some infrastructure where if there really is a community of need for this, that lets them commission their own data source. We should have, if we'd known it was going to be sort of successful, we'd have thought about the data governance in the first place. Because apparently you can like sell these email addresses for loads of money if you want. But you get the idea. So I'm not saying there's anything special about Feed Finder or App Movement in particular, other than that they're good examples of these. They're good examples of this sort of concept of community-based commissioning and therefore that relational model. So if you look at the group, I should say, our shift has been then from our sort of approaches to HCI embedded around thinking about interaction techniques and machine learning. We do all that sort of stuff as well, but it's very much now this focus on digital civics. So that means digital technologies and their roles in new forms of participatory citizenship. So how do we infrastructure citizen participation across these different areas? And actually, like I said, there's some great funding schemes in the UK. So one of them is the Centre for Training for Doctoral Digital Civics, which funds 58 PhD students over a 9-year period actually. So they do an MRes first, then they do a PhD, and we can bring them through as a cohort. One of the other sort of interesting things about Open Lab is, I said that 120 people now, everyone's physically co-located, not just in the same building, in the same single space. We have a big open plan space that everyone occupies, the professors to the PhDs. So we have a nice program here of cutting across a number of departments. So a bunch of these students, even though they're based in Open Lab, they're registered in public health, or in planning, or in politics, or in sociology. Everyone has multidisciplinary supervision teams, so anyone in Open Lab is partly supervised by someone there. So that's nice, and to go with that, actually we have this Digital Economy Research Centre, which we got awarded similar sort of time. So that funds 25 postdocs, not actual postdocs, a bunch of them are research engineers as well. So in this sort of great situation where we have this, we can sort of leverage the PhDs with the postdocs, working in collaborative ways across multiple disciplines with a whole range of partners. Obviously there's not a lot of people here, so I can't really summarise. Primary sort of organisations we work with are the likes of, you know, industry-wise, Orange Labs doing big data on telephony, Microsoft and the BBC, but we're much more engaged with people like the IFRC, International Federation for the Red Cross. I'll mention one of these projects in a minute. And big national charities like Barnardo's, third sector organisations that are like a 3,000 employee children's charity interested in social justice issues and vulnerable children. So it's a big initiative, and it really, from 2014 onwards, this is how we've moved our work around. And I want to sort of talk to you about some of the key elements of that. And one of them is this concept of doing research in a place-based way. Okay, so in this sort of age of everyone's got to be world class, this idea of sort of working in a sort of locally, in a local context, isn't so popular because it has this sort of parochial feel to it. And we work in place-based ways, not always in Newcastle. So things like mass consultations in our city and engaging in building digital technologies that can support citizen engagement, through to a bunch of work we do in Athens. So if anyone knows anything about the politics of austerity in Greece, they're very interesting. Big demonstrations followed by what's called the solidarity movement. So solidarity movement are literally these neighbourhood, almost level civic groups getting together, not being formally constituted as a charity, but working through consensus and direct participation to do education, health, all sorts of things, alternative shops and social clinics. And so in that sense, we set up a little lablet in Athens with some of the Greek researchers. My team's recruited some Greek PhD students to work there. And that's sort of under this idea of not we're going out to support them, but actually in this sense that that's where the action is. This is where the interesting sort of civic models are originating. And likewise, often driven by not just at where we're located or where interesting things are happening, but actually by need as well. So we have a significant amount of work in Lebanon, working with displaced Syrian nationals around issues like access to healthcare and resilience around food. So again, some very sort of quite politically motivated, action-oriented research with refugee groups. So there's a sort of place-based element to that research agenda. Again, I guess, you know, sort of an obvious point that doesn't really go for digital civics necessarily, but thinking about open approaches and open technologies. So everything we do in the Digital Civics Initiative is open source. That's sort of a prerequisite that we made. And we've had some sort of quite large impacts from nutrition, dietary recall systems that we build, big open source dietary recall systems, to physical activity monitors. This was actually a piece of hardware that was used in the world's biggest physical activity capture exercise, 100,000 people in the UK, their 7-day activity. And it's quite interesting working even with public health and clinical epidemiologists and clinical collaborators, how working in open source ways, which are very unfamiliar to them when you start talking to them initially, actually a great way of building sustainable collaborations. And I don't mean sustainable in that we get pile of money for it. I mean sustainable in the way that we can work with universities without a research project and continue to contribute to a knowledge base. So I've got meetings here at Monash with the Monash team who are building the Australian content for our dietary recall system, not as part of a project, just because they know it's a good thing to do and it will really help them do future studies. So we have this system in Arabic, Portuguese, Danish, Australian. I don't think that's a language, but it's a locale. So, and again, our sort of platforms for collaboration, building them in open source ways, because of course most governments now have strong policies around procuring open source platforms because they're worried about sustainability and not getting tied in. And I guess our last thing is, our real shift in what we do is moving to thinking about participatory platforms. So most of our focus now is on platforms to support participation. And I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the learning ones. We're going to pick one of the examples, but I guess that's the sort of big shift in our focus. So I've talked about a bunch of things, thinking about so adult child social care, public health, local democracy, and I want to talk a little bit about education. Just pull out this means, so what does it literally mean to be pursuing a digital civics project, looking at relational models, and then thinking about school education? Because it's not sort of obvious how something like Feed Finder or App Movement would relate to learning in school. So I want to pick a few examples. And of course, you've got to start with on the one hand, you've got to start with a context. What is the education context in schools in the UK? And I think it's pretty similar to Australia, with less private education, but still interestingly similar. And also a sort of theoretical perspective on this. And I don't mean a cognitive theory of learning, I mean a sort of systems level theory of education and society. So if you look in the UK, this is actually from Blackpool area, John.
I recognise all of these.
Okay, there you go. That's pure chance. I found them somewhere. This is what my is. So what we do is, in the UK, if you don't believe school teachers are intrinsically motivated and are just going to try and do good things for kids, what you do is you build a league table that lets them compete with each other. Sound familiar? So this is what you do, yeah. And this is the UK education policy. Of course, this is what, when people talk about new management approaches in public services, that's what they mean. League tables, neoliberal models of organisational efficiency, schools basically competing with each other to get good league tables, so wealthier people, we all know the consequences of it. Wealthier people move into those areas, those kids are better supported, they have better outcomes. But it's on the other side of it, it is a sort of model of accountability. So it's not, it's not like an evil plan of someone. Some people actually think this is the way to do things. So you give parents visibility about how institutions are working. But the consequences of it can be pretty dire. Yeah. So, and Spurs and Hodgson is a really interesting paper, well worth reading. It's not an HCI paper; it's an education paper. Take this sort of ecosystem model of learning. And trying to explain what is the sort of environment where schools will thrive and children's educations will thrive. And they talk about, they do a sort of multi-level analysis, starting at the micro, the child's interaction with their parents and teacher. And then, I think it's, what's the next, it's meso, they have a meso level, which is about interactions within a school, then an exo1 level about a school's interaction with community groups with other schools. Then an XO2, in thinking about the region, and then a macro, thinking about national education policy. So they sort of have this ecosystem model, and when you look at that ecosystem model and think about what is happening in UK education, what's happening is we have these league tables, and schools are becoming more and more insular. They don't interact with other schools, they don't interact with community groups, they don't interact with business, they're just looking inward at these KPIs that they need to produce. So it's really interesting. They talk about this as a low opportunity progression equilibrium, where things are really contracted in and they're inward looking. Yeah, fine if you live in a rich area with well-resourced schools, with parents who are professionals, the schools are going to look amazing. But in these other areas, they're not. And particularly when you're thinking about what they call these young people who are NEETs, children that are sort of destined to end up not in education or employment, the learning that they do in school is not contextualised at all. They're basically trying to reach reading and writing and mathematics and science levels, which they're very unlikely to achieve. But actually, the content, the work that they're doing, has no meaning to them. They don't understand. They might be studying chemistry with no understanding of what chemistry is actually happening out there in the world, in the community around them. So we've very much focused on digital civics approaches to education in schools that are about connecting schools to their local resources. Yeah, so if you think about, how can we look at schools in a place-based way and think about how we can build digital technologies around them. Really simple one, thinking of the location around the school, a physical place, as an asset for learning. So this is a system called ParkLearn, and the PhD student who's working on it he's thinking about connecting parks, park rangers and volunteers in parks with teachers in order to try and set curricular activities that students can do on mobile phones, going out of the classroom into those locations, and actually undertake activities that match with the national curriculum, the curriculum the teacher's got to teach against. So there's a sort of very simple observation here, which is that we try and get children literally out of schools into these public places. On one hand, it's actually about sustaining these public places, but the other is about sort of the idea of the learning and the place not being more integrated, and not that schools are literally the only site of learning. And actually we extend this to working with heritage groups, with all sorts of local organisations, but what you need is an infrastructure that will bridge between the volunteers or the heritage museum employees or the park rangers and teachers to bridge that sort of curriculum external activity divide. We can look at it in other things, such as music. So this is a nice example I was telling John about earlier. So another PhD project where he's looking at music education in schools. High end of primary school and low end of secondary school. And what they're doing is they're looking at low bars to creativity, so easy ways that children can somehow have some creative, have a creative impact. But also ways of linking to community. So in this case, he has a web browser, which is a mixing desk, which is sort of no mean technical achievement itself. Actually, it's like a nice 8-track mixing desk. You mix it in music in a web browser, and we have a whole pedagogy for children learning music by remixing the different tracks. The drums, the voice, the whatever the different instruments are, and they share those mixes with each other. And there's a pedagogy behind that, and they reflect on each other's mixes, but they also share those mixes with the local musicians, because all the music they're mixing is music produced by musicians in their local community, and they share those mixes with them, who also comment on those music. So you might think like, okay, so what? And the so what is that, if you look at children's understanding of where music comes from, they all think it's like One Direction produced music in LA. They don't realise there's actually a whole community of music makers around their actual location. So we have another PhD student who's looking at a follow-on from this, which is where children actually then engage with these musicians who are producing this music to plan music events that are run in the school where the musicians come in, and the kids actually put on these events, market them and run them. So these are sort of simple configurations of technology to infrastructure schools to engage with communities. And of course, maybe something even more relevant, given the interest in doing Mike a bit here, we do other work. So one of the other resources for a community, if you live in the west end of Newcastle, Newcastle University is a resource, actually, and yet we have no way of really, the university of undergraduate computer scientists infrastructuring those schools. You'd think they'd be the best taught school kids taught in IT in the world, but of course they're not. So what we have is a process of engaging undergraduate students. This is work we're doing with the BBC, where undergraduate students design IT, computational thinking and programming activities. Oh, sorry, does that mean I'm done? I'll speed up. So undergraduate students develop content based around develop programming activities based around BBC content, Doctor Who and Green Planet, I think it is, Blue Planet. And then we coach them up and they go in and deliver this content in schools. So of course, for the children it's really interesting anyway, because a lot of these children don't even know anyone who's been to university anyway. For the students it's excellent, because actually they learn about communicating, they learn about being an advocate for science, technology and engineering, not just being someone who then pops into some corporate job when they graduate. And of course, it's a process where we think about how can the university actually be a resource for the community around it. And there's a whole process actually. The whole thing starts off actually in the school with the kids themselves talking about the sort of things they want to do. Then that feeding through to the students designing the activities. Okay, so that's our sort of thinking about how relational models might work with schools. How am I doing for time actually? Do I need to speed up? Oh, yeah, I do. Okay. All right, I'll give you one more sort of system thing. So this is a different sort of place-based thing in that it's not the West End of Newcastle. It's 120 different countries in the world. I'm thinking about how do you engage young people of a certain generation. So we're talking about what we call Generation Z. So that's the sort of young people who have always known the internet as the sort of visual medium that it is today, and I've never known it as any different. And here we're thinking about how do we engage young people in future forecasting. It's actually worked with the Red Cross, thinking about what does the organisation need to be like in 2030. We call this a future forecasting activity. So the challenge here is thinking about, okay, how do we engage? How do we support young people's voice and leverage this in a future forecasting activity? So we sort of thought, well, let's not build a platform and give a poor young person yet another login to remember, and then remember to log in and put their data in. Let's engage them in the channels they're living in everywhere. And of course, most places in the world, WhatsApp is one of the dominant medias for people to collaborate and communicate. So what we do is, youth member of the Red Cross logs in with and registers with their WhatsApp number. Just their name and WhatsApp number, and we have a bunch of volunteers who then put them into groups. So as these registrations come in, a volunteer creates a WhatsApp group and puts 4 of these young people in the group, which they're the admin on. And if you're the volunteer supporting this activity, you might create 20 of these groups, 20 of these WhatsApp groups. Obviously it's hell on the phone, but it's still quite cool. So you put them into a group and you tell these young people that they've got to take on a role. So you give them a role. It could be the environmental scientist, or the technologist, or the economic advisor, or the cultural advisor. They play this role, and then for 10 days, we give them activities to do. So first one is really simple. We push them an activity which is come up with a name for your group. Then we say, come up with a newspaper front story for what the world's going to be like in 2030. And then finally we say, create a video of a report to the Secretary General of the Red Cross about a Red Cross initiative in 2030. So what's happening is, these young people in the group are madly WhatsApping away, trying to answer these challenges and create media. As well as working within their group, they're also in a bigger group. So the environmental scientist is in a bigger WhatsApp group of 100 other environmental scientists. And every couple of days we have a conference where we might do something like everyone take a photo of a challenge, environmental challenging reason, push it through, or you do emoji votes, or you discuss some issue. So what we've got is the sort of them working in their little group, but then them working in a bigger specialist group. So this lasts for 10 days. We ran it last September in 4 different time zones, English and Spanish, 4,000 people doing it. It's and of course we can download WhatsApp. If you're on the desktop version, you can download the transcripts. So what we do then is we have all the media produced by the activity, which feeds into the Red Cross's formal future forecasting process, and you have, of course, hundreds of thousands of words of interactions, which the national societies are very interested about, because Red Cross is a traditional hierarchical organisation, and understanding what a young, Kenyan member thinks a challenge is very interesting to them. But what we call this is unplatforming, actually. So we talk about not building a platform. There is a platform, but the platform is for the 20 administrators to get the content, to push through the members and download the transcripts afterwards. And actually there's some nice outputs from this as well, even like a newspaper produced from the content that was distributed at the General Assembly of the Red Cross in Turkey last November as well. So, okay, I should round up then. So thinking about rounding up, I guess digital civics is quite a broad enterprise in that sense that there's lots of different domains, and even when we focus on education, there's a lot of ways of adopting these relational approaches. I guess the bigger point is thinking back to the university and the city. So I can't talk for all disciplines, but for me the sort of transformation in thinking is thinking about, how should we be interacting with wider society? What is the role? We're very much stuck in this mode of we produce students who then are good for industry and that's good for the economy. There isn't so much of this dialogue around, universities as civic institutions and as people who advocate for social justice, Are students going out and being change makers in society as well as in industry? And I think for us also our mode of working, where we're thinking of innovation in technology, is about partnership with communities. You can't just create a new trusted partnership with a bunch of schools and go and deploy a load of systems with them. What you need are long-term relationships. Often you need to work with the GPs, with different NGOs in those organisations. So we actually need to configure ourselves differently, not as the producers of knowledge that then gets thrown over the wall somehow and translated in civic society, and even in industry, I'd say. I'd say we could have more just models. And I guess when it comes down to it, this is my last slide, really when it comes down to it, I guess we have these sort of questions. These sort of questions I posed to our City Council when we had a discussion about thinking about our strategy for digital and the university and the city. Starting off with, you know, do we believe that universities are not the only source of knowledge and innovation? And I think, you know, often we don't. We're in this sort of mode that we're the innovators, we're the knowledge producers, and the organisations we work with are going to consume it. And yeah, there's tricky bits about translation, but actually what we need to be is we need to configure ourselves to do innovation and knowledge generation in partnership with organisations and civil society. You know, so in that sense we can think of the city, or we talk about city because of Newcastle, as actually an infrastructure for research and knowledge production. On the other hand, we think of the university actually as a capacity for the city. Yeah? And we need to configure ourselves like that. Even getting, I don't know what it's like at Monash, but even getting it so that a member of community can come and access our facilities because they're working with us. So it's incredible, you know, there's incredible bureaucracy around that in most UK universities. Most people wouldn't even bother doing it. It'd be like, oh, insurance and oh, whatever. And you know, we don't even have the basic processes, let alone this idea that our students, when they come to study, should be out there advocating for their disciplines and subjects in schools or whatever. And lastly, I'm really thinking about how can we reconfigure ourselves as institutions, both in our teaching and our researching and our practices, to make this sort of thing happen more. Okay, thanks for listening.